can I say welcome to our second talk again, of course. The themes of tonight's talk, again, couldn't be more topical. COP26, climate change, and local policies, especially transport, which are affected by climate change. Robin Cathcart, our speaker tonight, has worked in this field for several years and done research on it, and he will now be giving his information from his experience, both in the broader global area of this matter and also about local issues which do affect us naturally. If you have a question, I hope you do have, please send them in via the chat button, and then at the end of each session, they will be sort of brought together, and Bruno here and Robin will handle them. I don't think Robin would like people to interrupt and put their hands up in the middle, because it does tend to affect the flow. So I think that's everything we need to say. Yes, so can I then hand it over to Robin to start? Robin?
Yes, I'm not sure how to. Oh, I do. I found it.
Unmute.
I've unmuted. I'm just sharing screen.
Great. You've done it.
Yeah.
You've done it. Thank you, Robin.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction.
Thank you.
I'm not a climate scientist, by the way. I'm a civil engineer. I spent most of my working life as a transport planner, mainly doing strategic planning for transport. But when I retired, I took up a visiting research fellow at Westminster University. And I had intended to study things affecting the future of transport and realized quite quickly, in fact, that climate change was the thing that was really going to affect transport. So I have since then, and it's a few years ago, spent a lot of time reading about and researching what's happening in climate change. So I'm what you might have called an informed amateur. The talk tonight, I'm actually going to speak in two parts. Because it's a Zoom session, I actually suggested that an hour was too long and I should split it, so I have. So part one is talking about, first of all, what is climate change, its effects and sources. And the second part of part one is actually about what we need to do if we're going to get to net zero. And the second part is really about what we are doing in trying to get to net zero. That's globally referring to what happened at COP26 and a review of the UK government, Warwickshire County Council, Warwick District Council, and their performance, and then ending with some comments on frustration and optimism, and finally some suggestions on individual actions. The first thing about climate change, what is it? Well, climate change is caused by greenhouse gases, which are trapped in the atmosphere and stop the heat from the Earth reflecting back out into outer space. And as a consequence, the Earth is warming. The greenhouse gases, principal greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide comes from the process of producing energy mainly, and it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And that's part of the reason, is the reason why climate scientists say that even if we change now, it's going to be generations before we feel the benefit. The second one is methane, largely from decomposition of vegetable and animal matter. Found extensively, it's in oil and gas because it was created when they were decomposing millions of years ago, in household refuse, in waste tips and so on. So it's quite common. It's about 25 times worse in terms of its impact than CO2. It only lasts in the atmosphere for about 10 years. And then nitrous oxide, largely produced from agriculture, fertilizer or misuse of fertilizer, with 300 times worse impact than CO2, and stays in the atmosphere for about 100 years. The activities that we have causing climate change are on this pie chart. You can read it. The principal one is production of energy, about 73%. That comes from industry, from transport, and from energy use in buildings. And then second to that is agriculture, forestry, and land use, which actually causes about 18%. And then a battery of less significant but quite important uses. I'm going to talk about energy and agriculture. There isn't time to go into the detail of the rest of it. The effect of warming, we've actually warmed to about 1.2 degrees. And warming has been traced since 1850 is generally taken as the base point, more or less the start of the Industrial Revolution in this country. The black line, up and down black line, is observed temperature over that period from 1850 to 2020. The brown line is simulation of human and natural causes of temperature increase. And you can see it follows fairly closely to the black line. The blue line, this one down here, is a simulation of natural causes only. So the conclusion is that the human impact is the gap between those two, so quite significant. What are the effects of the increase in temperature so far? Well, this quite clever diagram comes from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change synthesis report produced last year. And it's actually a representation of the world. So you have up here, this is North America, Central America, South America, Europe through into Asia, Africa, Australia, New Zealand. And this is a map of change in hot extremes. Hot extremes are just temperature occurring above average. Hot extreme in the UK doesn't sound very much. It's above 25 degrees, above an average of 25 degrees for more than 3 days in succession. Doesn't sound a lot, but in fact, if you think of the British summers, it probably is, it is quite extreme. Anyway, hot extremes have been experienced almost everywhere in the world. So North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia. So that's one of the biggest impacts seen as a temperature rise. There's also a change in heavy precipitation. We're actually experiencing a change in the pattern of rainfall. We're now getting more intense rainfall for shorter periods, followed by dry spells. The green is the parts of the world which have experienced this heavy precipitation, and that's the eastern part of Eastern and Central North America, Europe into Asia, bits of Southern Africa, a little bit in South America, and North Australia. And heavy precipitation goes to flooding. And there have been reports of flooding in North America, obviously throughout Europe last year. In Australia, we don't hear much about flooding in Africa, but it has been occurring as well. And then the converse of that is drought. And drought is being experienced in these amber countries, here through the Mediterranean into Asia, and quite seriously down through Africa and South Australia. And one of the things that goes with drought is fire. And we've seen wildfires in California, in Eastern Europe, significant in Australia, quite widely reported. And we never hear about it, but it has been quite serious down this part of Africa. And the other thing is the temperature of the sea is rising. This is a plot against a record set in the period from 1870 to 1960. And this is the percentage of the ocean which is above that base temperature. So it's nearly 60%. And that's because the sea is a major sink of heat. it actually absorbs heat. And that means that we're not absorbing it, but it does have a serious impact on things that live in the sea. And we've seen about bleaching in coral reefs, we've seen about changes in patterns of fishing, etc., etc. And that's a consequence of the temperature change in the sea. So the emissions, you can plot quite easily. This is by region, again from a baseline of 1850. This is the contribution from the EU, the rest of Europe, United States, China, and the rest of Asia. Trying to bring that down to the specifics, this is emissions from selected countries over the period 1750, but really 1850. China, United States are generally regarded as being the worst emitters, and on this metric they are. So I've included them. I've put in the other European countries so we can see how we're doing in comparison. I've included India as an emerging economy and Uganda as a developing economy, again, just so we can see the contrast. Now, this picture it's quite bold, but you get quite a different perspective if you look at per capita greenhouse gas emissions. Because here, the United States is by far the worst offender, followed by largely Europe, with China now coming in here. But China actually exports a lot of the products that are used to produce greenhouse gases. And you can see the effect of this, which is what's called trade-weighted emissions. Trade-weighted emissions are the emissions produced in country minus emissions to produce goods that are exported, plus emissions of goods that are imported. And that changes this picture again. Although the United States is still the worst offender, you can see by now that China, on this basis, because it exports so much of its production, on trade-weighted emissions is actually right down here. And Europe is more significant in these terms, because all of Europe, imports a lot of our goods now. India is down here, and Uganda, we don't have data for. And I wanted to do this because everyone, well, I hear quite regularly people saying, well, there's no point in us doing anything because China is creating so much greenhouse gas. But the reality is that China is creating so much greenhouse gas, partly to actually send goods back to us. In fact, 50% of the greenhouse gases produced in China are exported in produce. The other thing is that China is running incredibly fast to stand still. Last year, China built more offshore wind in 1 year than the whole of the rest of the world did in the previous 5 years. So China is trying really hard to catch up and reduce its emissions. The other thing that's worth looking at, because it is relevant to the future, this is carbon intensity of GDP. So the axis is the number of dollars to produce, sorry, the number of kilograms to produce $1 of GDP. And you can see that this peaked in the 1930s and has been declining ever since. And we're now down in this end. China's seems a bit high, but I think it's probably catching up. And India is coming in, and I wanted to pick out India in particular, coming in here. And you can see that India is really actually has peaked and is now producing less emissions per pound of GDP. And that's the pattern you can expect from these emerging economies, that they're going to be much more efficient in creating their wealth than we have been in the past. And therefore the climate impact of them will be less than we might have expected from history. And the result of all this is that we're warming too fast. This is what would happen if there were no climate policies. This is what's happening under current policies, somewhere between 2.7 and 3.1 degrees of warming. This is what would happen if all the called pledges and targets of COP26 were met. And I will talk in detail about them shortly. And this is where we'd like to be, the 1.5 degree pathway. And as you can see, we are a long way off it. So what do we have to do to actually get from here to here? Well, we have to progress towards net zero by 2050. And net zero is defined as the greenhouse gas emissions must be equal to or less than the amount removed from the atmosphere by either natural means or carbon capture technologies. In other words, we must emit we must reduce our output of greenhouse gases to be less than the amount that we can absorb either naturally or through technology. And how do we do that? Well, there are a number of people who've tried to model this, and a number of models of paths to net zero. And I've chosen to use the one from the International Energy Agency, IEA, to illustrate what we have to do. And this refers to energy, which, to remind you, is 73% of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is some of the key statements from their paths to net zero. So by 2050, all governments need to significantly strengthen and then successfully implement all their energy and climate policies. And we'll spend some time later talking about those. Electricity is going to be the technology of the future. And all the technologies we need to achieve the deep cuts in emissions by 2030 exist, and the policies that we need are already proven. It's a bit more difficult to get to net zero by 2050 because some of the technologies are not yet in the market. And the biggest opportunities concern advanced batteries, hydrogen electrolyzers. We'll talk about that later as well. Direct air capture and storage, we'll also talk about later. And this is a diagrammatic path to net zero from the IEA. And they've actually done these for intervals through to 2050, and I'll take you through them. The first thing to point out is this, which says that from 2021, there will be no new unabated coal plants approved for construction. Unabated coal is coal that's burnt without removing the carbon dioxide. So abated coal is coal that in some way has the carbon dioxide removed when it's burned. And the other key point is that from 2021, no new oil and gas fields should be approved for development, nor should there be any new coal mines or mine extensions. And you might actually think about these in regard to the news we've had recently about coal mines and North Sea oil and gas in the UK. And I'm afraid that's happening worldwide. This is not being met. But continuing on the path, at present, solar PV and wind only accounts for 10% of electricity generation, whereas unabated coal, i.e. coal which is producing the CO2, and natural gas and oil, all unabated, account for over 60% of total electricity generation. And fossil fuels account for almost 80% of total energy, and other things. Only 5% of global car sales are electric. Retrofit rates, that's fitting things out to be low carbon, are way behind. So that's more or less where we are. And then these two overriding requirements, which are not being met. By 2050, well, first of all, we have to be substantially increasing the amount of solar and wind. This is 10 times the level it was in 2020. If you remember, I talked about technology, transport, and buildings as being the main contributors to energy use. On technology, the industry has to change from current technologies to clean technologies. And to do that, by 2030, the new technologies have to be demonstrated at scale. At scale means beyond prototype stage. All new buildings have to be built as zero carbon ready. 60% of global car sales need to be electric. And this is low carbon hydrogen. This is hydrogen produced from electrolysis of water. So we have to start producing it in quantity because it becomes very significant in the energy mix. Then by 2035, on the industry track, all new electric motive power has to be best in class, and all new capacity additions in heavy industry have to be low emission. We have to have fitted capacity for carbon capture and storage. This is the process where you actually take the CO2 out of whatever, the coal or the gas, and store it somewhere for either permanently or for some reuse. So we have to have started that and got it up to 6%. In the developed world, all the advanced economies have to be using net zero emission electricity, and no new internal combustion engines can be sold, and half the heavy trucks have to be electric. By 2040, industry has effectively re-equipped itself with low emission technology. Worldwide, all electricity produced is net zero. All unabated coal and oil has been phased out. Electrolyzer capacity, that's the production of green hydrogen from water, is scaled up enormously. Oil demand is down half of what it was in 2020. And on the transport path, we have to be moving aviation and shipping to be low emission fuels. On the building path, half of all existing buildings have to be retrofitted to zero carbon ready levels. There are roughly 20 million houses in the UK, and I reckon that no more than 10% of them are zero carbon ready. So we are talking about having to retrofit 18 million houses in 20 years' time. And if you actually compare that to the current government record, you'll see that it's a really big ask. So moving on, by 2050, we expect that we have reached zero emissions. So renewables are almost 90% of total generation. Almost 70% of electricity is from solar, PV and wind. Nearly all industry is low emission. Nearly all buildings are zero carbon ready. We're producing large quantities of low carbon hydrogen and capturing large quantities of CO2. And that's what we need to do to get to zero emissions. The effect of that is that the production of oil and natural gas declines from a peak, which is around about now, down to here, getting close to zero. And any oil, gas or coal that's used by then is abated. The carbon is taken out by some form of carbon capture. The contrast to that is electricity. This is renewables, wind and solar, producing by far the largest proportion of electricity. We have contribution. This is hydropower. This one is nuclear, and this is other renewables. But what's significant by now is that all these, which are coal, gas, are right down to near zero. And as I said, this is using abated. The carbon is removed. But all this is going to come at quite significant expense. We're currently investing somewhere between 0.5 and 1 trillion US dollars in energy. About here, we need to move that up to somewhere between 1 and 2 trillion dollars, quite a large increase at this end of the spectrum. So the change will be expensive, but on the upside, it will create a vast number of new jobs. This is 30 million new jobs working in clean energy and related sectors in 2030, not 2050, in 2030. And the good thing about it is these jobs are all high quality, professional construction, manufacturing, high skill level, medium skill level, and a very small proportion of unskilled jobs. So that's the kind of actions we need to take to get to net zero. It has a cost and it has an upside in terms of good quality employment. If we now look at agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, abbreviated to AFLU, which is 18% of emissions, it's a different picture, a wee bit difficult to explain as well. This is what is called indirect land, and that's environmental changes that take place on managed and unmanaged lands. But the question marks are here because actually there's a lot of dispute about what these figures really should be. So this suggestion is that this is carbon dioxide that's absorbed, and this is carbon dioxide that's given off, and the balance is this, which actually is absorption of CO2. But because these estimates are uncertain, people don't pay very much attention to this at present and focus on this bit of the diagram, which is from managed agriculture and forestry. And again, you have a certain amount of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases absorbed. You have a larger quantity of greenhouse gases given off, and the balance is this. This is the 18% greenhouse gases coming from agriculture. And this is the bit that we actually need to deal with to get down to net zero. Looking at what's happening in agriculture, we're actually growing more. This is trends in croplands or crop production. And you can see that generally they're on an increasing trend. This is a funny scale. It's not logarithm, it's some kind of funny decimal scale. So this is 10 times higher than that, and this is 10 times higher than that. But nevertheless, the impact is there. We are producing more and more, but also slaughtering more and more animals for meat each year. This increases pigs, a huge increase, nearly 1 billion more over the period from 65. A lesser but still significant increase, sheep, goat, and cattle. Not shown in this graph is poultry. The poultry, and the reason it's not shown is, in fact, it's off the scale. So where we're talking about something like 2 million, 3 million cows, we're talking about 3 trillion chickens and turkeys are killed each year for meat. So the effect of all this is, or to achieve all this, we are using more and more fertilizer, a huge increase since 1960. And this is the main, excuse me, the main contributor to the nitrous oxide emissions. And what's actually happening is that there's an unbalance between the application of fertilizer and its value. So it's reckoned that only 50% of the fertilizer contributes to growing things. Increase in pesticides, less significant in greenhouse gas terms, but very significant in terms of biodiversity. And biodiversity is critical to the pattern of agriculture we need to move to. This is an analysis done by the Lancet Commission. It's the same Lancet as publishes the Lancet. It's actually the medical professions body which actually is looking at climate change. And what they have done is they have created for each of these agricultural sectors a baseline that they regard as being sustainable. So the sectors, this is greenhouse gas emissions, this is cropland use, fertilizer use, sorry, freshwater use, nitrogen application, phosphorus application. And what they're saying is that all of those have moved beyond their sustainable level. All agriculture has now moved beyond its sustainable level. And by the time we get to 2050, we have moved dramatically beyond the sustainable level in agriculture. So this is actually quite a frightening analysis. So what do we have to do? Well, the first thing we need to do is to reduce food loss and waste. 14% of all food produced is lost between harvest and retail, and that's mainly in developing and emerging economies. 17% of total global food production is wasted, mainly in developed countries. It's 11% in households, 5% in the food industry, and 2% in retail. And these statistics are just, I think, frightening. 7% of greenhouse gas is caused in producing food that's never consumed. And 30% of agricultural land is used in producing food which is never consumed. So we have to change that. We have to stop that. There's no technology involved in doing this that we don't know about now. It's a question of investment and education, I think. We have to improve agricultural practice. We have to diversify agro-systems away from monocrops by planting trees, establishing non-crop vegetation, conserving natural ecosystems and native vegetation. We have to select crop and livestock species that are appropriate to the environment that they're being used in. So you grow things in the place that's best fitted for that to be grown. You have to enhance soil condition by implementing mechanisms and practice to preserve biodiversity, hence reducing pesticides. We have to control erosion, improve water management, etc. And during the last 150 years, half of all agricultural topsoil has been lost through bad management. We have to protect water sources and improve irrigation systems to maximum efficiency, because the agricultural sector consumes 70% of the planet's fresh water. And we have to monitor weather patterns and weather data so that we can make informed decisions about when to change practice. And the third one is we have to change our diet. We have to eat less meat. 100 grams of beef protein creates 60 times more greenhouse gas emissions than pulses. Global diets need to converge towards local variations of a predominantly plant-based diet. And that essentially is saying that we actually have to, our plant-based diet has to use ingredients that are locally produced, not soya milk from Brazil. The reduction we get from eating less meat has a double benefit. We actually lose all the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the production of meat. So that's both in croplands and actually in animal husbandry. And that releases land, which can then become a carbon sink. And this is so significant that one of the United States universities has worked out that if every adult in the United States reduced their meat consumption by half, it would take them 25% along the path they need to travel for them to get to zero emissions. It's that significant. And that brings me to the end of the first part of the talk. Half an hour. So I'm quite happy to take questions on this. I actually reckon you need a break after this, and that's why we agreed to put it in two parts. I'm quite happy to take questions on the first part. At the end of the second part, I'm quite happy to take questions, and I don't mind if they cover both parts of the talk. So this is really up to you how you want to proceed.
Thanks very much, Robin. Just to remind everyone that they can ask questions in the chat during the presentation, so not to disrupt, and I'll summarize them at the end. I think everyone's probably reeling from all the graphs and charts that you presented. It's a lot of information, quite scary as well, I think, in some aspects. Marianne had a question about the role of nuclear power. I think it crept in on some of your later slides. It wasn't on some of the earlier slides in terms of the path to net zero. I just wondered if you had any insight on what kind of role nuclear power is going to play.
Yes, up to now, most authorities have tried to hypothesize how we get to net zero, of which the IEA is one, as I said, have come to the conclusion that there has to be some nuclear power in the mix. It's partly because of the variability of renewable energy, and partly because they are of the view that you cannot install enough renewable energy to meet the whole demand for energy. There is a body of thought, and I actually will refer to it towards them, that says that that is a mistaken assumption. But at the moment, most authorities would say there has to be a fairly small but not insignificant amount of nuclear in the mix.
Thanks. I also had a question going back to, I think it's one of your first slides. You mentioned about nitrous dioxide, I think it was, or nitrous oxide in fertilizer.
It's nitrous oxide, yeah, N2O.
Yes, and you mentioned there was a misuse of fertilizer. I wonder if you could expand on that rather.
Well, basically the fertilizers spread at the wrong time of year. So fertilizers is spread at the time when the crop is not needing it. So they've worked out that 50% of the fertilizer split on the land makes no contribution to growing the crop because of this. It's a mismatch between the needs of the crop and the time that the fertilizer is applied. It's as simple as that.
Quite a shocking wastage there.
Yeah, yeah, and the impact is not just greenhouse gases, because the runoff from over-fertilized land all goes into rivers. You get algal blooms, which take out the oxygen, which kill the fish. You know, the consequences of misuse of fertilizer are quite widespread. But it's controllable. It could be changed.
Surely that's a matter of education. You need, I mean, the fertilizers must cost money.
Yes.
So the farmers don't want to be wasting it anyway.
Yes.
I would have thought stopping that was pushing against an open door.
Well, yes, but it is actually a matter of education and getting people to understand the significance of what they're doing. I mean, a large part of the problem comes from monoculture, particularly in the United States is probably the worst example of monoculture, where they have the same crop planted over a huge area. I don't know if you watched David Attenborough on Sunday. He was looking at the almond production in California. They have 4 million almond trees in the same area. Anyway, so when the people are farming these monocrops, I just think they just seem to use, and it's partly down to the big agrochemical businesses. They don't try to educate farmers what the best time and the best level of fertilizer, because obviously it suits them to sell as much as they can. So there is, and that's part of the response in agriculture is actually education and getting people to use the land sensibly, much more sensibly than they were now. There's an interesting bit of research which said the best combination you can have for good agriculture is traditional knowledge allied to good scientific advice. So you're sticking to the traditional knowledge, but then you're tempering that by teaching people how our knowledge of agriculture, modern scientific knowledge of agriculture, can help them apply the same techniques as they have been doing. And that maximizes crop production.
Thank you.
Robin, may I, it's Richard Ashworth. Could I just take you back to the question about nuclear? Have you a view as an engineer between the massively complex and difficult to commission attempts in places like Finland and China, as compared with the proposals to have much smaller modular units, which I think Rolls-Royce are working on?
As an engineer, I mean, I don't have any great knowledge of nuclear. I am much more attracted to the micro path than I am to the Hinkley Point path. The technology that they're talking about for these micro generators is more or less the stuff that's been used to power nuclear submarines. You know, it's an extension of that, and it's a kind of level and scale that it's a scaling up of existing practice that's well known and has been used reliably for years. Whereas I think when Hinkley Point is a fine example, EDF have built two of these. They're trying to build two of these now, one in Finland, one in France. And they're both way behind on budget. Way over budget and way behind on timescale. So the technology that we're putting into Hinkley is unproven. So that's the big contrast. And of course, the timescale and the budget for a Hinkley Point compared to a micro one using a stepped up turbine from a nuclear submarine, the gap is just enormous. I can't help feeling that the micro path is much more sensible.
Thank you.
I had a question here from Barbara saying that she's asking, would you say that any of the carbon capture technologies you mentioned could save us from what looks like a pretty hopeless future? Much of what you're saying leads me to a feeling of hopelessness.
Well, yes. Yeah. My wife said I shouldn't do that. Carbon capture. The technology for carbon capture is proven. There are carbon capture plants in use in a number of places. I think the most successful one has been in Norway. But the plant is actually next door to a gas mine, whatever you call it. A gas well where they're producing gas. And they're actually, the gas comes out of the ground straight into this carbon capture, and then it goes off to wherever it's going to be used. And that has been very successful. There are other examples, and the technology and the principle of storage has been tested fairly extensively as well. There's a big problem with it. Well, there's two actually. One is it's expensive to transport the gas if you have to move it any distance. And that's why they're actually doing full-scale trials of carbon capture in the UK, or setting them up now. And one's taking place in Aberdeen, where I think it expects to intercept gas coming out of the North Sea. Another one's in Teesside, where there's a large chemical industry creating a lot of greenhouse gas. So in both cases, the gas doesn't have to be transported. So that's one problem dealt with in those two locations. The other one is cost. The IEA, in their path to net zero, assumed that there would be a tax on carbon greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide equivalent of $100 a ton. And the reason for that is that carbon capture, I've seen prices quoted for carbon capture and storage ranging from $30 a ton to $300 a ton. And the middle figure is around about 80, 90. And that seems the most likely for most types of feedstock into the system. But if you're being taxed on carbon production, as you are in the UK, at something like £15 a ton, you're not going to pay $90 to capture the carbon. So, and the reason why the IEA has used $100 is that is the lever that pushes people towards carbon capture and storage. If it's going to be effectively used, that lever has to be applied by governments throughout the world. There's only one country in the world that charges more than $100 for carbon production, and that's Sweden, which actually charges $150 a ton. But interestingly, the GDP growth in Sweden is above the European average. So that kind of gets rid of the myth that you can't afford to do these things, because obviously in Sweden, it has encouraged a GDP growth. The UK, it notionally charges £30 a tonne to the energy suppliers, but there are discounts offered, and the figure comes down to, I think, roughly between £15 and £20 a tonne. So there's no incentive. There's no incentive to use carbon capture and storage. So there needs to be either a requirement, you have to do it and pay the money, or there has to be a tax that makes it affordable, in inverted commas. And of course, the big advantage of the tax is that it actually allows you then to manage the impact of the transition on the population. So you hear politicians saying we can't afford to do this, it'll impact on the less well off. But if you actually had a tax on carbon, the revenue from that could be used to mitigate the impact on the less well off. So it makes sense in a lot of metrics, but it's just not being done. It's not being done anywhere but Sweden. And it would have an impact. It would make a difference. In fact, it's almost essential under the assumptions of most of these. It's a bit like nuclear, actually. It's built into the assumptions of all those models, including, by the way, the UK's model to net zero.
Thanks very much for that. I think if everyone's recovered, maybe we can progress with part two. Okay.
Part two starts with COP26, a discussion thereof. COP stands for Conference of Parties. COP26 follows well, it was intended to consolidate the results of the Paris COP, which I think was COP19. And it had mixed success. They're very difficult, these things. They are the United Nations climate change preferred approach, but they're difficult, they're very bureaucratic. 141 countries attended in Glasgow, and there are a fair number of groups of countries that come together because of a common interest. So you actually have this dialogue with a large number of participants, all trying to win the argument to their benefit. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it makes for a very bureaucratic structure and difficult to get agreement. But this COP26 has actually had a mixed outcome. It's done some good things. The UK, as you know, was the president. Alok Sharma was the actual minister, and he's regarded as having done very well, in spite of the fact that he probably started too late. His appointment came too late. The president of the Paris one was appointed 2.5 years before the conference. Alok Sharma was appointed about 9 months before, and he got very little support from his colleagues in government. But nevertheless, he's regarded as having done well. So the good things, some of the good things, I can't go through them all. The ambition and mitigation was good. Mitigation is the process of minimizing the effect of greenhouse gases, so it's reducing it. And the other term you hear is adaptation, which is actually how we adapt to the consequences of climate change. So the two things go more or less in parallel at the COP. So the ambition on mitigation was good, in that they now have an annual accelerator, which actually is the next COP will be next year in Egypt. and governments are expected to come back to that with improvements on the offers they made at COP26, and that's trying to speed up mitigation. They also did quite well on adaptation, in that they produced a process map on what they would try to achieve between Glasgow and next year in Egypt. There was a good announcement on forestry, but it needs to be, there's no path agreed for implementation. It was pretty bad on finance, 100 billion shortage on climate finance. That's essentially to actually help emerging and developing countries in their response. And then the big failure, if you can call it that, is that there wasn't a real agreement on the progress towards 1.5 degrees of warming. And that arose because there was insufficient momentum from leaders and governments to increase their targets ahead of at Glasgow. So that even with all the new pledges for 2030 made at Glasgow, will still emit roughly twice as much as is required for 1.5. And no single country that Carbon Action Tracker, who produced this, analysed, has sufficient short-term policies to put itself on track to net zero. And the 2030 actions are more often than not inconsistent with net zero goals. What's happening is that if you ask governments to say what they will do by 2050, they are quite happy to give quite ambitious promises, because that's way in the future. If you ask them to be specific about 2030, they're not quite so generous in their promises, because those are actions that they may have to initiate themselves. So you get this mismatch between 2050 targets and 2030 actions. And although globally around 90% of emissions are now covered by net zero targets, the quality of most is questionable. So the outcome of that is, if you look at this thermometer, we're here, which is 1.2 degrees of warming in 2021. We would like to be here, which is the 1.5 Paris Agreement goal. The current policies and action are taking us towards here, which is 2.7 degrees. Targets for 2030, so this is the undertakings that governments have made that they will achieve by 2030. If they're achieved, would take us to 2.4. The pledges, which is the promises made to 2050, combined with the targets for 2030, would take us to 2.1 degrees. And this optimistic one is what would happen if all the pledges and targets were implemented to the maximum extent possible. We might get to 1.8. The reality is that currently we're probably heading for somewhere nearer 2.4 than 1.5. So putting that on a time scale, this is current policies in action. This is the 2030 targets, the 2.4 degrees. This is the combination of the 2030 targets and the 2050 pledges, which take us to 2.1. This is the very optimistic one, and this is where we need to be. So that here, the ambition gap for 2030 is huge. That's between 19 and 23 gigatons of CO2 equivalent has to be taken out of the system to bridge that gap. It's a huge gap. So what's happening is that governments are saying that they're going to do these things, but the actions they need to implement them are just not there. And that's the problem, the gap between promises and action. So we look at the UK, and the first thing is that most people reckon global warming is not happening in the UK, but it is. This is taken from the Climate Change Committee. I'll explain what they are in a minute. But they have taken a baseline, which is here, the average rainfall between 1980 and 2000. And this shows that prior to that baseline, we have had less rain. And since the date of that baseline, we've had more rain. So our rainfall is increasing. Our temperature similarly is increasing. This is the same baseline point. So since the baseline of 2020, so between 1980 and 2000, this baseline, our temperature is increasing, although prior to that, it was below. And the same thing on sea level. Baseline here, current moving up to here, and history down to here. So we are actually being affected by climate change, temperature, rainfall, sea level, all being affected. Now, the Climate Change Committee. The Climate Change Committee was set up by the then government in 2008. It had a dual task. The first one was to research and make recommendations to the UK government as to what it should be doing to meet the climate change target. That climate change target is now net zero by 2050. Theresa May in 2018 made that change. And the second part of their brief is to prepare an annual report to Parliament, which actually sets out the progress that the government is making against the targets, so against actions they need to achieve the target. So this is the difference between the government ambition compared to the climate change pathway. This is the climate change pathway, and this is behind the pathway. Now, I have to be fair and say this is actually on the 2021 report to Parliament, and the government strategy they looked at was prior to the white paper on the government's path to net zero. So this is historical, but it does demonstrate that we have lagged behind where we should have been, certainly were in 2021. We actually, I mean, British government claims to have been very successful in responding to climate change, and it has actually reduced its greenhouse gases, but it's done that by shutting down a whole raft of old coal-fired power stations and replacing them with gas, which produces less emissions. So they very much picked the low-hanging fruit, because these coal-fired power stations would have been phased out anyway because they were past their sell-by date. So the statement they make is correct, but it isn't actually showing current progress. This is more typical of current progress. If you look at the picture for their comparison against the government's net zero strategy, it actually looks better. The orange is where the government has said it would like to be, and the diamond is where the climate change have said they should be. So by and large, it's not too bad. Some are higher, some are lower, but the trend, the path is more or less the same. So you think, oh, good, they're now back on track to where they should be. Unfortunately, not true, because there's a huge gap. In the same way, at the global level, there's a huge gap between the words and the action. So they now need to deliver the plans to implement the net zero strategy. The things that are missing are strategy for full decarbonisation of the power sector, agriculture and land decarbonisation strategy, a roadmap, to achieve the targets of a roadmap for transport, but there's no action for the development of a credible demand management. Although the policy for buildings is progressing more slowly than it should be as well. So this is what's happening. Same as at the global level, these promises are made in the white paper. The gap is between the promises and the action needed to achieve them. if we now, and the thing that's surprising about that is that the benefit cost ratio for these measures in the Climate Change Committee's recommendations is huge. Most public infrastructure investment in the UK will do well to achieve a cost benefit ratio of 2 to 1. But this shows that nearly all the adaptation measures needed are achieving better than 2.1, up as high as 10.1. So the cost benefit return on implementing the climate change measures is enormous compared to what you would normally expect to achieve in public infrastructure. So there's quite an incentive to do these things, although there's no action. If we now look at the role of local government, this is all taken from the National Audit Office. There are 333 local authorities in England. There's the London boroughs, the county councils, district councils, unitary authorities, etc., etc. 91% of them have adopted at least some commitment to decarbonise. And 45, there's been an estimate that 45 of the policy areas needed to move towards the net zero involve local government. So the role of local government is significant, and there's lots of them. The other indicator here is that there are 22 grant schemes for net zero work that local authorities could apply for last year. And these come to 1.2 billion of funding from these 22. But the thing about them is that they're all competitions. You have to bid for a share of the funding for the particular scheme that you think you could be successful at. And therefore, the finance is not being spread nationally. And this is reckoned to be a deliberate approach by government. By having 22 schemes, they can say we are approaching net zero on a broad front. We have 22 schemes, but none of them is funded adequately to allow it to be applied nationally. So, I mean, 1.2 billion spread over 333 local authorities doesn't give each of them very much money. And this is all seen as being a tactic to give the impression of action. The reality is that there's confusion. The central government responsibilities for local authorities, it's just spread out among different departments. So at central government level, business, energy and industrial strategy is responsible for achieving net zero at central government level. The Ministry of Housing, etc., is the steward of the local government finance and actions, and therefore, notionally at least, it's responsible for local government progress towards net zero. But the Department of Environment, etc., has responsibility for waste, which is a major issue and source of greenhouse gases at local authorities. The Department of Transport provides policy and funding to help them run and maintain their local networks. And although there are some documents which I've read saying what should be done, is there's no actions following these documents. There's no assistance. There's no help. The Treasury and the Ministry of Housing, etc., take decisions about local government funding, but there's no evidence that they're taking account of climate change in current allocations. And there's a raft of other departments with what's called cross-cutting responsibilities. It's like training and procurement and so on. And central government really hasn't got its act together. It hasn't yet developed, excuse me, with local authorities any expectation about how input they're going to have to achieving net zero. It hasn't set out to local authorities how it will work with them. Some departments have started to coordinate, but there's no single point of responsibility that allows you to try to make fundamental improvements. And as I said earlier, neither Ministry of Housing or Treasury have assessed the totality of funding that central government needs to provide to local government that's linked to net zero. And the conclusion, again, the National Audit Office, is that overall local authorities are finding it hard to engage with central government on net zero. And consequently, achievements are not what you could expect. So this is the county council, Warwick County Council. The figures at the top, these are an assessment undertaken by a body called Climate Emergency UK. They've rated all 333 English local authorities on a set of criteria that they have concluded measure performance against net zero. Warwickshire scored 25% on that assessment. The county average was 40%. The highest county was Somerset County Council with 62%, I think. Now, I've tried quite hard to find out what the county council is doing on climate change. I sent an email to the lead councillor asking her if she would give me the links to the documents that describe their actions or intended actions on climate change, and if she'd put me in touch with the lead officer. And I'm afraid to say I had no response. This document I found on their website, and it is a report prepared by officers to the council on their actions on climate change mitigation. So they've got in 3 scopes. Scope 1 and 2 are things they can do something about themselves. Scope 3 involves third parties and are more difficult. The recommendation from officers is that the county should focus on Scope 1 and Scope 2 only. They have a policy on trees. They have undertaken to plant 1 tree per head of population in the county. And they have in their county council plan a number of statements on climate change, but they are very high level statements and there's no detail attached to them as to what the content is and how it's going to be achieved. So while I may actually be, because of the lack of response, I may be underestimating, the picture from the county does not seem very good at all. They're not doing very much. The district, on the other hand, is doing better. On the same assessment by Climate Emergency UK, they have scored 53%, and that's above the average for non-metropolitan districts. But unfortunately, the highest score is 92%, and that was achieved by West Somerset and Taunton district, which has a population of 150,000, which is actually not very different in size from the new South Warwickshire district. So there's no reason you might say why the district shouldn't be aiming at a much higher score if a same size of district can do that well. But nevertheless, what they've done is good, and I've been helped. It was a councillor who pointed me in the direction of the document Climate Change Action Programme, and I have been in contact with the lead officer who has been helpful. They divide their action programme into 3 ambitions. First one is to be a net zero carbon council by 2025, and to ensure that the services provided through contractors get them to be net zero by 2030. Now that's very ambitious. That is actually a very ambitious target. They divide each ambition up into 4 themes, and they have 13, and within these themes they have commitments, which I think are really actions, but the table describes actions as something else. They call them commitments. So that's 13 things they will do to actually get towards that target. Ambition 2 is to have the whole of South Warwickshire low carbon by 2030. reducing emissions to a minimum of 55% by 2030, and they have produced a plan to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050. And again, that's very ambitious. It really is. So this one has got 6 themes and 16 commitments. The final one is an adaptation one. If you remember, I said there's 2 courses being pursued. One is mitigation, reducing the amount of greenhouse gases, and the other is adaptation, is actually how you adapt to the higher temperature. So they have an adaptation ambition, which is to enable our environment and communities to have adapted to a potential of at least 3 degrees of warming by 2100, which again is ambitious. But the problem they have is the same as the one I was talking about earlier. 23 out of their 54 commitments depend on some kind of action from central government. So they're swimming upstream against the current, I think. So what we've seen so far is, I think, not encouraging. We've seen it at international level, at UK national level, at county council, well, actually not at county council, so at global level and UK government level, there are statements of targets, but in all cases, the lack detail of the action is needed to actually achieve those targets. And that seems to be the nub of the problem, that politicians are just not prepared to take the actions needed to get there. And I find that terribly frustrating, because the amount of solar energy that hits the surface of the Earth in 1 hour is greater than the total amount that the human population requires in a year. So that there's an abundance of energy available. The problem is the ability of governments to match their targets with actions. And secondly, they actually are not dedicating sufficient funds to support the transition. And unfortunately, until these 2 actions, or 2 sets of actions, are implemented, we're not going to be in a very good place. So that's the frustration. I'd like to, though, just have a brief thing about the amount of energy potentially available in the UK. And I actually start by an example, which is a heat pump. It's a water-based heat pump in a town called Drammen in Norway. The population of Drammen is about 67,000, i.e. not very different from Leamington. And it has this heat pump installed, which takes, so a water-based heat pump, which takes water from the fjord. So in the winter, it takes water from a fjord and provides enough heat and hot water for 85% of the population. The water from the fjord comes out at 8 degrees centigrade, and the heat pump produces hot water at up to 90 degrees, which means that old buildings don't have to be retrofitted to be able to use it. The town has saved £2.7 million a year from the installation, and an average of, a total of 1.5 million tons of CO2 saved. The cost to users is 1p per unit, compared to 5p, which would have been for gas, and 8p, which would have been for electricity. And the system here was designed, built and installed by Star Refrigeration, a Glasgow engineering firm. So you might ask, I mean, I just like this project, which is why it's here, but you might ask how relevant it is to both the UK and Leamington. Well, the answer lies here. This is a water source heat map prepared by DEC, the then Department of Energy and Climate Change. And it shows the rivers which have enough flow to be able to support a heat pump, a water-based heat pump. And if you look at the map, here is the River Avon. This is Birmingham, this is Coventry, and this is Leamington. So this analysis reckons there's enough flow in the Avon at Leamington to allow us to install a water-based heat pump district heating system, which is good news. And just as a corollary, Compton Verney actually heats its buildings with a water-based heat pump using water from the lake. But the point of this is that you can see from this that almost every town of any size in the country is either on a river or, as we know, on the sea. And there are rivers north of here as well. I expanded the map so you can see more clearly. And what I'm trying to show is that between the rivers and the sea, we have a huge reservoir of heat potential, energy potential. And we're also one of the countries with the highest wind potential in Europe. In fact, we have the highest wind potential in Europe. So this country, even ignoring solar, which is not insignificant in spite of our weather, has a wealth of energy sources. And there's absolutely no reason why we should not be able to transform this country to be totally serviced by renewable energy. And finishing on an optimistic note, which I'm sure you like, this is some work done by INET, which is a department at Oxford University, on trends, cost trends for components of renewable energy. What they've done is they've used the historical models of the reduction in cost and the increase in capability of new technologies like computers, for example, to set up the calibrate models, which they've then applied to try to assess the response of the two changes, improvement in capability and reduction in price, to the components of renewable energy. So this is the one for solar. These red lines are the assumptions that the various models and assessments, like the IEA one I talked you through, these are the assumptions that they have made about the reduction in price and increase in capability of the technology. And this is where the INET analysis has taken us. And that applies to the four examples here, less so with wind, but certainly true on batteries. And P2X is actually the production of hydrogen through electrolysis. All of them show substantially better cost performance trends than the assumptions made in the various projections of climate change. And they reckon, this is the good news about nuclear, they reckon that if this path is followed, and their analysis suggests it will, you need to have neither nuclear energy nor carbon capture and storage in the energy mix. So that's a very much more optimistic view of the outcome. This hasn't yet actually worked its way into the strategies. It's very new research. Hasn't yet worked its way into the strategies. And I'm not sure how many people will contest it. But if it is correct, if it's adopted, it will be a game changer. So that's the one bit of good news in the whole of my presentation. Then, the bigger picture, I've just expanded the solar one, just so that it's clearer. So these red lines are the assumptions in the various projections to net zero. And these blue and this blue line is the INET modeling. So that's just the same picture expressed differently. So to round up, I just would think we should just think about what we can do. And the first thing is we can spread the word. I mean, I think the implications of climate change are so severe that we all need to be aware of it, and we all need to be trying to respond to it. So the more people who know about it, the more people you tell about it, the better it's going to be. We need to minimize our food waste, and we need to eat less meat. And I'll repeat the North American experience. If every adult in the US ate half the amount of meat they currently consume, it would take them 25% along the path to net zero. A huge difference. We need to minimize travel. We need to walk and cycle on short trips. We need to take the bus or the train rather than a car. We certainly don't need to fly. We shouldn't use artificial fertilizers or pesticides in our gardens. And then we could actually work harder at lobbying our councils to improve. The information I gave you on the performance of the county and district was taken from this website, councilclimatescorecards.uk. And it sets out in some detail the performance of each authority against the set of each of the criteria that they've adopted as their measures of performance. So you can actually look at how our councils have done. You can compare them to the best performers, and you can lobby our councils to actually bring their performance up to at least the standards of the best performers. And I think lobbying and keeping pressure on politicians is something we'll have to do. And at that point, I will end. Thank you very much for listening. Stunned silence.
Muting, Robin. I am now unmuted. Right, so thank you very much indeed for that. We have maybe far too much to think about at the end, but I'm glad you've reduced it down to our local picture, what we can do. But I'm baffled by the fact there is no comparison between what the government is wanting and what the local councils want to do. We have housing spreading all over South Warwickshire with no public transport. What does that do for energy consumption? There's so many things which just don't make sense. How can we get policy? How can we feed through what is needed into policy? I don't follow it.
Well, I can't help you there. I think a large part of the problem comes from the fact that our government is very much departmentally focused, and there's no cross-boundary consideration as to the impact of policies. Mm-hmm. And the one that you refer to, as a transport planner, I think that the planning policy framework, the 2011 version of that, was possibly the worst thing I've ever seen. Because it encouraged what they call these garden villages, and they're being built throughout the country now because of it, and they're a disaster in transport, environmental, climate change terms. Absolute disaster. But the problem comes that they make these changes, and the minister makes his changes. He doesn't consult with others as to the impact his changes might have on them. I mean, a logical government, given the importance that should be attached to climate change, every government decision, the first consideration would be, how does it impact on climate change? And unless it passed that as a positive, it didn't go any further. Mm. And I just, until we actually get to that stage, we're just not going to make the progress we need to make. But I mean, getting politicians to do these things, our system of government is archaic. It is just not fit for a modern world.
Thank you very much, Robin. I'm glad to have it summarised so succinctly, even if not hopefully. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I think Marianne would like to say thank you at the end of the talk.
Oh, hang on a minute. I asked a question.
Oh, sorry, Marianne.
It's on the chat.
It's right.
On the chat.
Right, Marianne. Sorry.
Well, it's there.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm depending on.
Oh, sorry. Why is rail travel completely ignored? I meant rail freight rather than road freight.
Yes.
I mean, why is there no policy to move things long distance by train rather than by lorry? It must reduce carbon.
It does.
It doesn't seem to appear anywhere.
It does. I don't know the answer to that. mean, I do know that the analysis of freight in this country is appallingly bad. You actually ask the Department of Transport how information they have of projections of freight traffic, and all they can say is, well, this year it was that, and we expect it to grow this much next year. And it won't be much better than that. It's appallingly bad. And it always has been, all the time I was working.
Yeah, I didn't mean that. I meant actually have a policy to move the freight from the road to the railway, which means a national policy.
Well, I could actually say that there are no national policies, so why should there be one for that? I actually don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I do agree with you that it would make sense. And you do see, oddly enough, all the freight railways in this country are now run by Deutschbahn, the German railways, which also happens to be the major participant in our railway system, Chiltern Rail. And you do see, because they are now responsible for both, they make a lot of use of the Chiltern lines for freight, and you do see huge freight trains going through Leamington because of that. But it's a local thing. I think a lot of that is actually, it's cars from Jaguar going down to Southampton for export is the main traffic, I think. But I mean, you're right, there could be so much done and we don't do it. But I think this current government would, well, in fact, the last few governments would say market forces will determine what happens. We don't have a policy.
That's interesting. Thank you. That is very interesting.
Right. I don't know whether it's now my turn to say thank you very much. I think you are actually preaching to the converted here. I suspect most of your audience are as appalled as you are by the lack of planning, the lack of forethought, the lack of coordination, the reliance on market forces, which tend to be very short-term and very profit-based. But I suspect you are right, that this is something which, you know, the current government is not fit to do. And the fragmentation and competition, which are entirely artificial, because this should be national rather than local, all these policies about insulation and house locations and brownfield sites and rail travel and all that. Though I think actually there is a big increase in vegan and vegetarians coming up. So I think the eating less meat has actually already captured the public imagination in this country anyway. I think perhaps
actually meat reduction throughout Europe is going down.
Yeah, I think that has happened. And public transport in towns is obviously a major issue for everybody, partly because of the problems of parking as well. So actually, I have a feeling global warming does this country quite a bit of good, because we can now grow vines and have our own grapes and wine and stuff. But that's possibly a little selfish and short term. But thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk, and it'll give us plenty to think about. And I hope that there's some optimism among us, because we're quite sad to go to bed feeling really worried. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
And thank you once again, Robin, for your time and your thought. Thank you.